This is the Infotagion podcast, the vaccine to the disinformation virus. Companies like Facebook and Twitter have been called to account for their part in facilitating the insurrection in Washington, D.C. on the 6th of January. But incidents like this are in no way unique. In India, riotous mobs acting on disinformation campaigns and rumours on Facebook, WhatsApp and Twitter have been responsible for many murders and even lynchings, yet the social media companies have done little in response. I'm Damian, and in this podcast we'll be discussing these issues with Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a former Indian government minister and Assistant General Secretary of the United Nations, who has served as a member of the Indian National Parliament for Kerala since 2009. He's also chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology, and most recently a member of the International Grand Committee of Parliamentarians on Disinformation. We'll be hearing as well from our regular guest, the disinformation analyst Charles Creel. Shashi Tharoor, it's wonderful to have you with us on the Infotagion podcast. We met a few months ago at the most recent session of the International Grand Committee on Disinformation that was chaired by Congressman Cicilline from America, but was organised virtually because of the COVID travel restrictions. You were very interesting, I think, speaking at that occasion about the role of social media disinformation in politics in India. And I wonder if you could just describe that phenomenon today and how it has been used to create divisions between different religious groups, different ethnic groups, and different language groups within India.
Well, I'm afraid it's actually all been rather dramatic and rather unpleasant. I mean, we've had, I was an early adopter of social media, and we've had a sort of 15-year, and not even 15, probably more like a dozen years of experience in the Indian political and public space with the way in which social media has entered it. And, I'm talking about starting at a time when barely 10% of the population of India was estimated to be on the internet. And at that time, I dare say, social media could have been seen much more as a force for good than as anything negative, because at that time, certainly, we had an enormous number of voices being heard that previously did not have a chance to be expressed. And we had, I will say, a significant number of new ideas coming up and being battered around in a by and large constructive way. But soon enough, the political uses of social media became apparent to key politicians. And there's no question that the sweeping transformations brought about by technology helped to make social media ubiquitous in India. Twitter was the first thing to come, but then Facebook and WhatsApp obviously have vastly overtaken it. I think we have the largest audiences, national audiences in the world for both Facebook and WhatsApp, some 320 million users of each of those products. And so what people like me had earlier celebrated as benign developments in Indian society, the expanding reach of the mobile phone network, the affordability of inexpensive communications, the development and expansion of broadband connectivity, have all sadly now become politically manipulable to promote majoritarian nationalism, to enable not just new voices, but the voices of recyclers of prejudice. And this majoritarian nationalism in India, which is epitomized in the present ruling party, is pursued with ideological zeal by hundreds of thousands of social media warriors, organized into cells, paid for, each of them running multiple accounts, and essentially disseminating their political agenda in this process. And this has now become a very, very serious challenge in our public space. We have something like 925 million internet connections in India, Damian. Of those, about 80% are on mobile phones, which means that if there was a time when you needed to be sufficiently elite or educated or prosperous to have your own computer or laptop, or at the very least to want to go to an internet cafe and log in there, today, somebody with a fairly inexpensive smartphone, a smartphone costing about 150 euros, will be in a position or maybe even less than that in cost today, because some of the Chinese phones are very cheap in India, will be in a position to access the internet. And therefore, a lot of them find some of their worst prejudices and bigotry reinforced by the joy of discovering that other people share their prejudices and bigotry. And so we are really looking at a tool that the ruling party was the first to, and now other parties are trying to follow it, develop in a systematic, organized way as an instrument of their political campaigning. They have a powerful band of social media cyber warriors to propagate their message of Hindu chauvinism. Unfortunately, their political agenda involves contempt for minorities and hyper-nationalism. But now with this kind of system, it's been coupled with a capacity for Rottweiler-like attacks on political opponents. And the social media troll has become a vital foot soldier in the BJP's political campaigns. You have cyber cells of well-paid trolls set up, not just in India, by the way. We have a lot of expatriates, as you know, living abroad, which means that in different time zones, whether in Europe or in America or in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia, you have people organized and often paid by the BJP to flood the social media space at all hours. With this well-oiled and scurrilous machinery, a virtual army of paid political pawns operating multiple accounts geared to attacking anyone deemed inimical to the party's political interests or even hostile to its Hindu chauvinist anti-Muslim ideology, we have a real challenge on our hands. And the ruling party's cyber hit squads are so pervasive that it is difficult to express a liberal opinion on Indian social media without being assailed by a flood of insults and abuse. And frankly, the challenge is that the febrile message is so totalitarian in its omnipresence and in its intolerance of disagreement that it's become truly worrying. Now, you asked, how this is working in practice. I gave you sort of the way it's organized, but quite apart from the way in which it's organized, there is a fact that that specific tools have been used particularly effectively in India, perhaps more so than they have been used elsewhere. WhatsApp is a classic example. In India, people have been killed on the basis of fake WhatsApp rumors because it's so easy. It's certainly more difficult now, but it was so easy to disseminate fake news, as they call it, on WhatsApp, because each person could operate a group or a broadcast list of up to 256 other persons. And when you have an organized mechanism by a political party where they will pay one official, for example, to run 100 such groups, each of them targeting 256 people with an incendiary message, you can imagine how quickly virality would occur. Now, there's also non-political messaging that can take lives. We had a panic at one point in India when there were viral WhatsApp messages alleging that a band of child kidnappers and child molesters were prowling through various villages to kidnap children. It created a major panic in some parts of the country where villagers essentially shut down, locked up, kept their kids at home. And there were a couple of innocent social workers, traveling salesmen, and so on, who actually were lynched because they were suspected of being child kidnappers out on the prowl in their cars. So any car that was any out of town, out of village person was suspected immediately of being a child molester. And in one of the more savage ironies, in the state of West Bengal, an official sent out by the government to the most affected villages to assure them that this was fake news and there was no such thing happening, was himself lynched on the grounds that he must be therefore the suspect that he claimed didn't exist. So all of these things show the power of social media in a society that is still significantly either illiterate, about almost a third of the population, or recently literate without the sophistication that comes with reading and understanding. But we shouldn't talk about sophistication. A society with very high literacy like the United States has also proved itself capable being seduced by the lies of QAnon and the fact-free assertions of the outgoing president that he actually won an election he had comprehensively lost. So if educated people can believe that, why shouldn't villagers in India, who've dropped out of school or barely have a school education, not be equally vulnerable? But these are the dangers. And when you've got targeted messaging going, you can often educate people in WhatsApp University in ways that they might never have been educated before the advent of social media, or more accurately, miseducated, because the parties create groups defined by their interests, their caste, their religious identity, sometimes a specific issue or cause, bombards people with messages to reinforce their biases while convincing them their party is with them. And it's no accident that it was actually the IT cell head of the ruling party who on the 2nd of December 2020 became the first person in India to have a tweet labeled by Twitter as manipulated media.
I mean, the situation you describe in India is absolutely extraordinary, and the reports we've seen over the last last 2 or 3 years, really, of lynchings, of riotous mobs being formed on the back of social media rumours and leading to people's deaths. And this is a really clear demonstration of the real world physical harm that disinformation can cause. And the world has been talking about what happened in Washington, D.C. on the 6th of January with the sort of mob that took possession of the Capitol buildings there and leading to the deaths of 5 people in the action there. As another example of these dangers. But what has been the response of the social media companies in India to these atrocities being committed?
Well, as chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Information Technology, I've had occasion to summon these social media companies more than once. Part of the problem is, of course, in a very heated political environment such as prevails in India, these discussions very often descend into political name-calling, with Facebook in particular being accused by both sides of political bias, by sort of the left of center and opposition parties because of their failure to ban or restrict hate speech being propagated by people close to the ruling party, and by the ruling party who are allegedly employing a lot of people with opposition party backgrounds. So that kind of shouting match is often what happened. But amid all the cacophony of political mudslinging, I would say the social media companies claim to have standards, what they call community standards, that they look to uphold. Clearly, they're not doing a great job in terms of being able to uphold any standards, because you can pick up any public figure's timeline on Twitter, for example, and you will be assailed by a flood of negativity and viciousness, which obviously the managers of Twitter are not even trying to deal with. Similarly, when it comes to Facebook, where at least unlike Twitter, anonymity is a little more difficult. And nonetheless, Facebook has often found itself in a position where it's to put it bluntly, it's greed for things like political advertising have allowed a lot of the ostensible checks that they apply to slip. So one of our MPs found, for example, that the ruling party had placed 10 different sets of advertisements on Facebook's pages for various forms of supporting the ruling party, all giving the same incomplete and unverifiable address without a phone number. Now, in theory, that's not possible on Facebook. You have to provide a detailed address that can be independently verified and a phone number before you can advertise. But such rules appear to be breached routinely, and Facebook, in its desire for the advertising revenue, I might mention that the ruling BJP is by far the largest single contributor to the Facebook advertising coffers in India of any company, institution, anything. The BJP is the number one advertiser. Given all of that, they just turn a blind eye and let this happen. So all of that becomes a challenge too. And we haven't actually had terribly satisfactory answers, then you can imagine that the pro forma answers all look very good. We will have to look into how we report to Parliament on our discussions with these companies, but we have concerns. Some of them, of course, are perhaps of a, shall we say, a political nature, but the concern that disinformation can actually mislead people and sometimes into taking very seriously negative action, that's something which we are not yet satisfied there are adequate mechanisms to prevent. I'll tell you a story from 2013. So it really ought not to be possible today, but I'm not sure it isn't. In 2013, there was some incident of violence between people in India's northeast and the Muslim community there, which is a fairly substantial minority, in which some people died. I mean, there was very limited information available. What some malicious people did on social media, particularly on Facebook, but also, I believe, on other sites, including Twitter, was to take pictures of the dead from the Myanmar cyclone of the previous year or 2 years previously, Cyclone Nargis, in which large numbers of people had been killed, and they were sort of shrouded and awaiting burial, identifiably Muslim people. And they sent out those pictures saying, these are pictures of innocent Muslims butchered by cruel Northeasterners. Now, India's Northeasterners are a readily visible minority. They're recognizable because of their sort of Mongoloid-style features. They have high cheekbones and narrow eyes, and that sort of typical Northeastern look is a Northeastern Indian can easily be mistaken for an East Asian. So they're visibly different. So what happened was, incensed and inflamed by these viral photographs of Muslims allegedly killed by Northeasterners, a number of Muslim organizers of various groups and self-appointed vigilante associations started targeting Northeasterners working in various Indian cities, telling them, you better get out of here, we're coming after you. A major panic ensued, and upwards of 80,000 Northeasterners living and working in major Indian cities like Bombay and Bangalore started fleeing back to the Northeast for fear that they would be murdered in their workplaces or on the streets in these cities by incensed Muslim mobs. Now, everyone was at fault. First of all, those who started this false rumor and used these false photographs, or rather misleading, for the photographs were genuine but of a different incident. Second, those who acted upon them. Third, the people who believed the threats and started fleeing. And fourth, the authorities, both of the social media companies and of the local law and order authorities, who failed to prevent this. The police could immediately and should immediately issue a corrective saying these posts are false, there is no need for panic, these things never happened, please stay in your place, and address the inflamed Muslim communities that were threatening the Northeasterners. We actually had an almost farcical situation at one point when the Commissioner of Police in Bangalore rushed to the railway station where some 20,000 Northeasterners had congregated to flee. But by then it was too late. They'd bought their tickets and were boarding the train. And, if the police had learned at that point to use social media better to dispel these rumors, maybe that it wouldn't have come to that. Now, since 2013, what has happened is that the police have become a bit more social media savvy, true. But I don't see much evidence that the social media companies have become a little more proactive in discouraging campaigns, because it takes them too long to verify whether the campaign is genuine or not. Now, I suppose you could see their point of view. They'll say, look, if we took this kind of attitude and tried to prevent the flow of messages like this, would the Iranian protests ever have been possible? Would the Jasmine revolutions in the Arab world ever have been possible if we had cut off their messaging? And, you could say that perhaps, when something is to your liking, you applaud the social media companies for permitting and encouraging it. And when an outcome is not to your liking, you point fingers to them and say, you people are responsible. But unfortunately, more and more problems have been caused than have been resolved by the existence of these media. And I don't want to pretend I'm not aware of the good things. For example, many a disaster has been accompanied by very effective social media messaging, which has resulted in all sorts of useful things. People recognition of lost and displaced children and others have been reunited with families because of photographs flooding social media. During floods in my state of Kerala, we had marooned people on rooftops who were able to guide the rescuers to them because they were not visible from the ground level. Helicopters able to come because their locations could be placed on social media, and so on, and social media to organize relief supplies and so on. All these are good things. But when you think that so much damage has also been done, you ask yourself, is there some way that not an algorithm, but some sensible collection of human beings could play a more sensible and more proactive role in ensuring that social media does more good than harm?
I mean, the cases you describe, I mean, are extraordinary, and I think if anything like this had taken place in Europe or in the United States, then I think social media companies would have behaved differently. And it seems extraordinary that there's not been a bigger intervention in response to these terrible events, which have led to people's loss of life and violence against people.
That's right.
I mean, given these steps that were taken in America to deplatform Donald Trump because it was felt that his comments were inciting a sort of a riotous mob and may even cause an attempted insurrection. I mean, do you think there's a case for that being done in India as well? Do you think there are there leading politicians in India who you think have incited these riotous mobs and these events? And do you think action should be taken against them in the way it was taken against Donald Trump?
Absolutely, but this is where there is still an active debate going on in the committee because, for example, many members of the ruling party on the committee have taken a very strong stand that Trump should not have been banned by social media. They're arguing, in fact, that what gives these companies the right to deny a platform to a head of a government in that particular instance. He was stopped when he was still president. And they want to prevent that happening to ministers, government officials, ruling party figures in India by the extension of the same logic. So this debate is still going on. On the one hand, companies could argue we're a private company, we can extend our services to whichever clients we like, and we don't like this guy because he behaved badly, so we're kicking him out. That's one way of doing it. The other way, which is currently the argument espoused by those opposed to the banning of Trump or of anyone else, is that once a company acquires a significant size and following, it is actually administering a public space, and that therefore it has no right to deny access to that space to people whose views it disapproves of. It really has to provide freedom of expression. Now, ostensibly, both arguments are very strongly valid. But the difficulty, and this is where my political bias perhaps comes up, is that one side is more into disinformation than the others. Truth, and this is a global phenomenon, truth is optional. The larger truth of the nationalist message is all that matters, which is why the age of social media has been dubbed the post-truth era. Allegations are lightly, almost insouciantly issued, widely circulated, and rarely retracted. And the public is enthusiastically whipped up to hound the vulnerable. We've media trials now, routinely on social media, even if the print media is occasionally more responsible. But I should say, I don't want to give the mainstream media much of a pass either, because certainly in India, they seem to be increasingly led by the nose by social media, and they feel almost obliged to out social media and their headlines. So there's a lot of irresponsible reporting in the print media and sort of mainstream television channels and so on as well. But the fact is that this sort of nonsense media trials, salacious allegations, it's awful. I mean, we all know fake news has been derided enough in the contemporary world, but it exists because it has been manufactured to serve somebody's political interests. And that's usually the political interests of its most enthusiastic disseminators. They basically want a lot of people to vote for them on the basis of false information. And at bottom, the implicit attitude is that all is fair in love, war, and politics. But I would argue that the collateral damage that is sustained in the process is of democracy itself. And in India, certainly, Indian democracy has taken a shellacking from from this kind of behavior. I know that there have been concocted accounts of what leading opposition politicians have said, including often enough myself, photoshopped images seeking to portray traitorous behavior by opposition leaders. Because when you've got a government that says that opposition to it is by definition anti-national, then it's a very short step to creating proof to substantiate your allegations of treasonous behavior.
Well, I mean, and that's right. And I mean, we're both parliamentarians in our respective countries, and we all know that two politicians can argue with truthful facts about the same situation and paint that situation in totally different colours, depending on their point of view. And that's political debates, and people argue, and ultimately the voters decide. But what is quite different is not just using disinformation to mislead people, but when that disinformation might cause physical harm to others, when it could incite violence. And I think in America this month, I think what the social media companies have done is recognise that actually, even if it's the president, if he's inciting people to take to the streets and that leads to people losing their lives, then he needs to be stopped. That is dangerous. And that's not about free speech. That's about protecting the public square. So I wonder. That's why I wondered in the context of India whether the social media companies have been drawn to consider whether this is not about regulating speech, but actually about exercising some responsibility over public safety. And the other thing, I wondered if this is something that's part of the debate in India as well, which I certainly think it's become a bigger part of the debate in Europe and America, is about amplification, which is to say to the social media companies, even if you allow a certain sort of speech on your site, what you shouldn't do is let your tools amplify and recommend speech that is extremist and could incite sort of violence and danger and is almost certainly based on lies.
Right. No, I think these are all valid questions to which I don't have an easy answer. I don't think anyone does. There are laws in every democracy against inciting violence, and in theory, they should be applied. We are facing a grim situation in India today where these laws are being invoked by state governments run by the ruling party only against their opponents. And there seems little that can be done about the selective invocation of laws to silence dissent and the refusal to invoke the same laws to punish people on their own side. We actually have a minister in the government who led a mob in chanting, "Shoot the traitors, shoot the traitors," and who has not even had a case lodged against him, forget conviction or action, a year later. So we are facing a challenging time, I have to say, Damian, in that even the processes of justice and rule of law have come under strain in this atmosphere. The government and its institutions turning a blind eye to the excesses of their own partisans, while persecuting is not too strong a word, its critics. And I would therefore say that India has seen very little progress in stopping fake news, arresting its perpetrators, or limiting its spread, other than using the term to justify the selective targeting of journalists critical of the government. So just overnight, before you and I spoke, 8 Indian journalists and myself, for having cited one of them on a tweet, have been charged with an impressive array of crimes, including sedition, for having reported that a protester in the Republic Day riots of 26th of January who died had apparently died in police firing, as his relatives claimed. The journalists reported that in good faith, and when the police insisted, and I might admit that there was visual evidence to support the police, that the man died when his tractor overturned and there was no evidence that he'd been shot at all, everyone concerned, including myself, retracted either the claim or the report in the case of the journalists, or the citation of the report in my case. But we've nonetheless been sued, and the various heads that cumulatively would put us behind bars for 99 years for a message reported in good faith, and in my case done in a very constructive spirit. I said, I'm saddened to hear of the death of a protester in police firing. I call upon all sides to refrain from violence, whether protesters or authorities, because it demeans us all, words to that effect. And that is the impugned tweet. I deleted it to remove the words because of police firing or in police firing, whatever it was, and reissued the same sentiment. So it's all there on Twitter, even now, for people to see the way in which I was approaching these disturbances. But I am now facing 15 counts filed against me by BJP sympathizers in 3 different states. So these are the kinds of challenges we would have, whereas people have actually said inflammatory, bigoted, and prejudiced things, not in any way linked to sort of any exhortation for calm or cooperation or coexistence. Just inflaming sentiment, have never been charged. We are now supposed to be the poster children for the dissemination of fake news. So the selective prosecution of offenders, if offenders we are, that's for a judge to determine, is another problem we're facing in battling these forces of darkness in India today.
I think that was Anurag Thakur, wasn't it, who was recorded as saying "shoot the traitors."
It was indeed Anurag Thakur, yeah, Minister of State in the government, yeah.
And I mean, in cases like that, I mean, have people gone to the social media companies and saying, well, if messages like this are being shared on social media, and certainly if it was being sanctioned by anyone, but actually they have a role to step in here as well. I mean, is that a challenge that's been put to those companies, and have they responded in cases like that?
The issue is still open. They have actually not taken any action at all. In fact, as I said, it was only in December 2020 that they even flagged a particular tweet as manipulated media, and tweets of this gentleman uttering this charge, uttering this exhortation, "Goli Maro Salon Ko" was the exact slogan. Those tweets are probably still up there, because in any case, they were widely tweeted at the time, because lots of people were filming this particular rally on their mobile phones, and it was all over the place and widely reported. So Twitter might shelter behind the argument that this was actually a report of an event that actually did happen, so why are they being criticized for not taking it down? Nonetheless, the truth is that I don't think it ever has been taken down.
Yeah.
But by comparison with some of the absolute, vicious, prejudicial, bigoted, and otherwise, what can I say, nasty stuff that's out there, this almost pales by comparison, because you can at least try and dismiss it as a rhetorical exhortation in a political rally, rather than think of it as a literal exhortation. Though I dare say a court of law, if the man were ever brought to court, would find it an interesting issue to look at, whether you can actually say, go out and shoot the traitors, and justify yourself on the ground that it's merely a slogan and you don't actually intend anyone to pick up a gun and shoot anybody. That would be, but that trial has never happened, and nor will it probably, because the man is a minister in the government.
And from what you're saying, it sounds like the companies are unwilling to take a stand against government officials and the ministers because of the value of their business in India, and indeed the value of the governing party as a advertising client of theirs.
So that is the accusation. Wall Street Journal ran a very detailed attack on Facebook, making precisely the charge that you have made. As I say, in my committee, we're still examining the issue, and until the report has been agreed and published and put to bed, I'm not at liberty to draw any conclusions myself. I think it's fair to say that there are concerns, or we wouldn't actually have had these meetings of the committee. But until the committee concludes, I'm really not at liberty to express a personal view yet on this matter. But the concerns exist.
I'd like to bring Charles Krill into the discussion, who's with us as always on the podcast. But before I do, one question that we have discussed, and indeed discussed at the Grand Committee, the International Grand Committee as well, is whilst we all have our different legal traditions around the world and different ways of doing things, whether there should be some basic standards we expect the big tech companies to adhere to, in the same way there are some basic standards we expect the banks to adhere to on financial crime. So the UK has the Bribery Act, which can be used against any British national, British company trading anywhere in the world if they are trading in breach of it. And America has its Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I
That's
wonder whether there should be some international agreement that says that for companies, certainly companies like Facebook, who are headquartered in America, that they shouldn't allow things to happen on their services in one part of the world that wouldn't be allowed in their home jurisdiction. And I wonder whether
Well, that's going to be a problem, because already we've had a violent is the wrong word, because we're really talking about real violence elsewhere. We've had a very lively discussion in the committee about this very issue, with some members taking the minimalist position that Facebook and Twitter have no right to impose standards from their countries on behavior which is not illegal or has not been found to be illegal in other countries. In other words, if an Indian politician has not been convicted in a court of law for inciting violence, Facebook and Twitter have no right to take action against him until he's convicted. And that's a position adopted by many members of the ruling party, whereas some of us indeed take the other view, that the standards the best practices that you use anywhere in the world also ought to be available to India. Both Facebook and Twitter shelter behind their own so-called community standards, which they alone are the arbiters of its violation. But that is unsatisfactory to both sides, because the application of those community standards in India have left a large number of people unpunished, largely of one particular political tendency. Whereas under Indian law, no one has prosecuted them. I mean, in India, law and order is a state subject, so the state police forces of our 29 different states would have had to initiate action and take action and win a conviction in a court and so on. And with now an increasingly significant majority of our states being ruled by the same party that rules us at the center, that's becoming less and less possible. Another yardstick I'd talk about is the question of, quite simply, it's not just sensibilities that these people are disregarding, it's also facts. And so surely there is an obligation that lies cannot be allowed to be expressed freely on any public platform. Now, you and I are familiar with the idea that everyone's entitled to their own opinions and their own interpretations, but they're not entitled to their own facts. Facts are sacred, and they are as they are. Well, the fake news phenomenon essentially has completely thrown a challenge to that particular understanding, because it's taken over the social media world. Falsehoods are routinely asserted without the most elementary fact-checking, and the result is that you have a whole series of alternative facts out there, which in many ways the social media companies take no responsibility for. You may remember this extraordinary challenge in America when an American congresswoman, when Facebook, I believe it was Mr. Zuckerberg himself, used the freedom of expression defense by saying he couldn't censor a politician, asked him during a hearing, I think in the Senate, I may be getting my details wrong here, but I remember it very vividly. Are you saying to me that as long as I paid your advertising fee, I could put a lie on Facebook and you would feel obliged to publish it irrespective of whether you knew it to be untrue or not? And he said yes, whereupon she did just that. She paid Facebook for an ad that alleged that Mark Zuckerberg was a pedophile or something like that. I mean, I think that would have been probably actionable in America, but some other blatant falsehood. And Facebook, to be true to their founder's word, had to allow it to remain. Now, if that's going to be happening in America, you can imagine how much more difficult it would be to prosecute something like that in India, where the laws are simply not in existence, or where they exist are not as tough when it comes to enabling prosecutions of this sort of conduct. Mm. So we do need some way of being able to even subject politicians, elected officials, government officials to the yardstick of pure truth. Now, if you can't censor a government statement, even when you know it to be a lie, then you should have the ability to either annotate it or flag it with a thing saying there are other views on the same matter, which may be found with the following links, and people should be able to go and say, see that the government claims, for example, that they didn't do X, Y, or Z. Here are pictures of them doing X. Here is an eyewitness reporting them doing Y. Here is the factual position with regard to Z, whatever, so that a corrective is there. Otherwise, the government can just blatantly lie in your face, or the ruling party can, and no one can do anything about it. So these are the kinds of issues for which ideally we need to find some sort of global answers.
Absolutely. And there's the question of the in-law, the countries in the laws in the country itself, but also I think for international companies, the laws where they're headquartered too. And I think with Facebook,
and they do shelter behind that. They say that as long as we've not violated any national laws, you can't essentially hold us to account.
Yeah. But you think if I was operating an airline and one of my planes crashed, say in Africa, and it was discovered that my plane was in breach of the safety standards required in the UK for airlines, I wouldn't have a defence to turn around and say, well, it may be in breach of UK law, but it's not in breach of the law of the country where the plane crashed. There would be recognition that was not an adequate defence, and I think
true, but again, there would probably be a UK citizen on board that flight. So in any case, the law could be invoked to explain his loss of life. You see, whereas in India, you're talking about, for the most part, Indians doing harm to other Indians. So if they're not violating any Indian law, it could be a more valid defense than the analogy you've just offered.
Yeah.
But again, these are things that have to be thrashed out. And while lawyers and judges have their role in thrashing these things out, so do we, the politicians and public policy makers and lawmakers. And I think we really ought to grapple with these issues very seriously. And I think one of the good things about this conversation is a reminder of the need for us to exchange information and experiences with each other much more.
Yes.
To know exactly what others are doing and how well they're doing it.
No, I think
that we can learn from you and you can learn from us.
And I think that is absolutely right, and certainly something we've tried to do with this discussion and with the Grand Committee as well. I suppose I said the example that's been most recently, I think, is most often cited. I think was not in India, but in the case of the atrocities committed against the Rohingya in Myanmar, and which was some of which were organised on Facebook. And as I say, actually, in a case like that, should it be right that action could be taken against Facebook, say in America, for allowing that to happen in Myanmar, even though it may not have necessarily been something that was investigated in that country, and which I think is an interesting point of discussion.
Yes, and the Rohingya, of course, then crossed borders and went into other countries where the laws may be different as well, though in many cases these neighboring countries are also anxious not to create problems for their relationships with Myanmar. Yeah. But maybe this is a conversation for another time.
Indeed, absolutely. So, Charles, you've been listening in and joining us again from your family home in Oslo. There's a huge amount going on and a huge amount we've been discussing, but what's caught your attention in the last few days?
Well, since we spoke, Damian, I've been watching what I've been calling the privacy wars play out. And this isn't between governments and big platforms, but rather it's between the platforms themselves. And in particular, there's a battle brewing right now between Apple and Facebook. As part of their push for user privacy, Apple is introducing a new feature called App Tracking Transparency, or ATT. It'll come in early spring, and what it requires is that a user gives a company direct permission before that company can track the user's movements around the web. This is really big, and it's really important. But notorious web tracker Facebook is hitting back against this. They've claimed in an international influence campaign, and that's included ads run in the likes of the New York Times, that Apple's move would kill small businesses. Small businesses. Now, that's coming from one of the world's biggest small business killers, particularly known just with the stroke of an algorithm, they can shut operations down. So Apple's hitting back again. Tim Cook has publicly decried irresponsible actors in the app space, although he didn't name Facebook directly, and Facebook is now retaliating. The Information, which is a tech news site, says that Facebook is planning to launch an antitrust lawsuit against Apple, and that will make the case that Apple is breaking U.S. law with the move. So this is a space to watch, but it's really worth keeping in mind that it's also happening on the back end of the great migration, that is this great move from Facebook's messaging platform WhatsApp to platforms like Signal and Telegram. And what's happening with Signal and Telegram is that back in early January, while Facebook crazed armed insurgents were invading the U.S. Capitol, WhatsApp issued a new privacy terms that threw a message to users, and that prompted a grassroots viral message that made a lot of users question whether they wanted to continue using WhatsApp or move to another platform. And what this viral message said was that the content of messages on WhatsApp would now be shared with Facebook and could be used on the advertising platform. Mass freakout happened, and it wasn't quite accurate, but it was enough to prompt users to switch to the other services. Signal picked up 7 million new users. Telegram picked up another 25 million. Now, keep in mind, WhatsApp has 2 billion users, but nonetheless, they were shaken and issued clarification and then delayed the change for 3 months. So, what exactly are the new privacy policies accurately? Well, the contents of your messages can be shared and used in Facebook ads, but it only applies to users who interact with business accounts on WhatsApp. And the content of those messages can be used in ad campaigns by the businesses on Facebook. But what this really does that is so worrying is it ties the user to the content of their messages. And that's something that doesn't happen on platforms like Signal, where there's a complete disconnect for everyone except the sender and recipient. But the big question for me is, why is WhatsApp doing this at all? And this is strictly my speculation, but to give you some background, the founder of WhatsApp, Brian Acton, left Facebook in 2017 over these coming changes in privacy. And once he was gone, Zuckerberg announced that they would be integrating the message portions, that is, the back end of WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook, into a kind of Uber messaging platform. But why do this in each platform when they're so successful? Well, my take is that if you integrate the back end of these specific products, and it's no easy task, 2 years later, they still haven't pulled it off technically. But if you do integrate the back end architecture of these massive systems, then it'll be harder for governments to force Facebook to break up based on antitrust and monopoly laws. If your products are completely integrated, then it becomes nearly impossible to unhook them without destroying the beast. And that's important because the Biden government is in the mood, shall we say. So with the delay in the launch of new privacy features, WhatsApp's changes will happen in the spring, just as Apple's ATT privacy features are launched and the Biden government gets up and running. And there's a real chance we'll start seeing stars collide, Damian.
Thanks a lot, Charles. I think this is a sort of really interesting discussion as well. I'm sure something that we will look at again in the future, because it seems that the companies that are really setting their positions for probably what's going to be the big struggle of the next few years, which is defending themselves from antitrust investigations.
That's absolutely right. I mean, and they have to defend themselves against antitrust. And for users, what that means is that, first we had a big integration of services, then we have competition happens and fragmentation of services. Then if antitrust comes in, there'll be more fragmentation, then there'll be reintegration, and users are left shifting about and trying to decide how to communicate with each other.
And it's been interesting to see how many people have switched to Signal. I've seen on my Signal account lots of new faces joining, getting notifications that they're joining. But I can also see too, and I think how this is where it's a really good example of abuse of market power. That I can think of aspects of my life which it would be very complicated for me to remove myself from WhatsApp in order to organise myself for those things, because it's reliant on so many other people being on WhatsApp as well. So whilst I could use Signal for some things, I can't give up WhatsApp even if I disagree with what they're doing.
Absolutely. If you belong to groups where you're getting what you consider to be vital information, that's a quality to it. But also, how do we get our grandparents off WhatsApp?
Yeah, that is very true, and which is where I think this the whole antitrust movement, I think, is going to be. It feels like it's becoming a movement. It's going to be so important now, and because I think there are many cases that show how these services become so dominant that even when they behave against the consumer's interest, they still don't they still don't suffer as a consequence of that. Which shows how restricted the market has become.
Absolutely. I mean, it's worth remembering that in the United States, one telephone company used to serve everybody, Bell, and they were broken up on antitrust. So it can be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Charles, thanks so much for that. And Shashi Tharoor, thank you so much for joining us for the podcast. You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, featuring Shashi Tharoor and Charles Creel. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom, and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can also support this show by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/Infotagion podcast. Infotagion is a not-for-profit organisation, and all proceeds will go towards the making of this show. Thank you until next time.